I should have known something was wrong when my daughter Claire refused to let me read Ethan's college essay. "It's personal, Mom," she had said, her voice tight with that familiar edge of tension. "He wants to keep it private until after the ceremony." At the time, I thought she was being protective of my grandson, shielding his work from my critical eye until it was safely submitted and judged. I never imagined that the essay itself was about me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The scholarship ceremony was held at Northwestern University's Grand Auditorium on a crisp October evening. I had driven 3 hours from my home in Madison to attend, despite the arthritis in my hands that made long drives painful. Ethan was my oldest grandchild, the first of my 3 children's offspring to attend college, and I had contributed $200 monthly to his college fund since the day he was born 18 years ago. Of course, I would be there to watch him receive recognition for his academic excellence. I arrived early, as I always did, wearing my best navy suit and the pearl necklace my late husband Robert had given me for our 30th anniversary. Punctuality and proper presentation were values I had instilled in my children, though I noticed with disappointment that Claire and her husband Marcus were still nowhere to be seen when I took my seat in the 3rd row. I had specifically requested front row seats, but apparently someone had decided that other family members deserved that honor more than the grandmother who had helped pay for Ethan's education. The auditorium gradually filled with parents, siblings, and extended family members, all dressed in their finest clothes, cameras ready to capture their children's moment of glory. I watched them with a mixture of pride and judgment, noting which families looked appropriately formal, and which seemed to have confused a scholarship ceremony with a casual gathering. Standards mattered, after all. How you presented yourself to the world reflected not just on you, but on your entire family. Claire finally arrived 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, rushing down the aisle with Marcus and their 2 younger children in tow. My daughter looked harried, her hair not quite as neat as it should have been. Her dress wrinkled from what was probably a hurried drive. At 42, Claire still hadn't learned the importance of planning ahead, of allowing extra time for unexpected delays. It was a lesson I had tried to teach her throughout her childhood, along with so many other practical skills that she seemed determined to ignore. "Sorry we're late, Mom," Claire said breathlessly as she slid into the seat beside me. "Traffic was terrible coming from the city." "You should have left earlier," I replied, keeping my voice low but firm. "This is an important event. Ethan deserves to have his family here on time, properly prepared." Claire's jaw tightened in that way it always did when she was biting back words she knew better than to say. Marcus, my son-in-law, gave me a brief nod of acknowledgement before turning his attention to corralling their 9-year-old twins into the seats beyond Claire. I had never particularly warmed to Marcus, who worked in advertising and seemed to prioritize creativity over stability, but at least he had given Claire 3 healthy children and maintained steady employment. "Where's Ethan?" I asked, scanning the auditorium for my grandson's familiar sandy brown hair and lanky frame. "Backstage with the other scholarship recipients," Claire said, her eyes fixed on the stage rather than on me. "He'll come out when they announce the winners." The ceremony began with the usual formalities. The Dean of Admissions welcomed everyone, thanked the generous donors who had funded the various scholarships, and spoke eloquently about the importance of higher education in shaping future leaders. I listened with half my attention, the other half focused on mentally rehearsing what I would say to Ethan after the ceremony. I wanted to strike the right balance between pride in his achievement and gentle guidance about how he should use this opportunity wisely, avoid the pitfalls of college life that could derail even the most promising students. Several scholarships were awarded in the first half of the ceremony, each recipient walking across the stage to receive their certificate and shake hands with the dean. Parents applauded enthusiastically, some wiping away tears of joy. I remained composed, saving my emotional response for Ethan's moment, which I knew would be more significant than these smaller awards. Then came the announcement I had been waiting for. "Our next scholarship is the Harrison Foundation Merit Award," the dean said, his voice taking on a more reverent tone. "This $50,000 scholarship is awarded annually to one incoming freshman who has demonstrated not only academic excellence, but also exceptional character, resilience in the face of adversity, and a commitment to personal growth. This year's recipient submitted an essay that moved our entire selection committee to tears. His story of overcoming a toxic family environment to become the compassionate, self-aware young man he is today represents everything this scholarship was created to recognize. My stomach clenched slightly at the phrase, toxic family environment. I glanced at Claire, but she was staring straight ahead, her face carefully blank. Around us, other families murmured in sympathy and anticipation, eager to hear this moving story of triumph over hardship. Please welcome this year's Harrison Foundation Merit Award recipient, Ethan Foster. The applause was thunderous as Ethan walked onto the stage. He looked so grown up in his dark suit, so much like his father, so much like my own father had looked in the old photographs from his youth. Pride swelled in my chest, temporarily overwhelming the unease I had felt at the dean's introduction. My grandson, the scholarship winner. My contribution to his future, validated by this prestigious recognition. Ethan shook hands with the dean, accepted his certificate, and then did something I hadn't expected. Instead of simply returning to his seat as the previous recipients had done, he stepped up to the microphone that had been set up at the side of the stage. "Thank you so much for this incredible honor," Ethan began, his voice steady despite what must have been considerable nervousness at addressing such a large audience. "The Harrison Foundation asked me to share a brief excerpt from my essay, and I'd like to do that now, because the journey I wrote about is one I couldn't have completed without acknowledging the obstacles I had to overcome." Something in his tone made my hands grip the armrests of my seat. Beside me, Claire had gone very still, her breathing shallow and quick. My essay was titled The Grandmother Effect, Learning to Break Free from Generational Toxicity, Ethan said, and the entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. I wrote about growing up under the influence of my paternal grandmother, Eleanor Foster, who raised my father and later exerted significant control over my own upbringing. I wrote about the lessons she taught me, some valuable but many harmful. Lessons about conditional love, about perfectionism as a weapon, about using shame and criticism to motivate rather than encourage. Lessons about how family hierarchy should be maintained through fear and obligation, rather than genuine connection. The world tilted sideways. I heard the words, but they couldn't possibly be about me. They couldn't be describing the careful guidance I had provided, the standards I had maintained, the discipline I had instilled. My face burned with humiliation as I became aware of heads turning in our row. People who had heard Ethan announce his grandmother's full name. People who were now looking at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to poorly concealed judgment. My grandmother genuinely believed she was helping us, Ethan continued, and his voice carried across the silent auditorium with devastating clarity. She thought that pointing out every flaw, criticizing every choice that didn't align with her vision, and withholding approval unless we met her exacting standards would make us stronger, more successful, better people. And in some ways it did make me stronger, but not in the way she intended. It made me strong enough to recognize toxic behavior patterns. Strong enough to set boundaries. Strong enough to choose a different path than the one she had mapped out for my entire family. I couldn't breathe. The auditorium felt suffocatingly hot, the walls pressing in on me. I wanted to stand up, to shout that this was a lie, a betrayal, a gross mischaracterization of everything I had tried to do for my family. But I remained frozen in my seat, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but listen as my grandson publicly dismantled the narrative I had built about myself as the family matriarch who had sacrificed so much for her children and grandchildren. I wrote about specific incidents, Ethan said, and now I could hear the emotion creeping into his voice, the pain he was sharing with hundreds of strangers. Like the time I was 7 years old and won second place in the school science fair. My grandmother's response wasn't congratulations, but a detailed explanation of why my project hadn't been good enough for first place and what I should have done differently. Or the time I was 12 and told my family I wanted to be a teacher like my mom. My grandmother spent the next hour explaining why teaching was a waste of my potential, why I should aim for medicine or law, why I needed to think about financial success and social status, rather than following my passions. Each example he gave landed like a physical blow. I remembered those moments differently, remembered trying to push him toward excellence, trying to help him see his full potential. How had he twisted my guidance into these accusations of harm? But the incident that really crystallized everything for me, Ethan continued, happened 2 years ago when I was 16. My mom had been planning a family vacation to Florida for months. It wasn't fancy or expensive, just a week at a rental house near the beach, but she was so excited about it. She had saved up for 2 years to afford it. The day before we were supposed to leave, my grandmother showed up at our house unannounced and told my mom that the vacation was irresponsible, that we should be using that money for my college fund instead, that my mom was being selfish by prioritizing a frivolous trip over my future. I felt Claire stiffen beside me. Her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Yes, I remembered that day. I had been trying to help Claire see reason, trying to prevent her from making a financial mistake that would impact Ethan's opportunities. Why couldn't anyone see that I had been acting out of love? My mom cried that night, Ethan said, and his voice cracked slightly. She canceled the vacation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She told me and my siblings that something had come up, that we'd go another time, but I knew the truth. I had heard the entire conversation. I had seen my grandmother reduce my strong, capable, loving mother to a crying mess who questioned every decision she made. And I realized then that this wasn't help. This was control. This was emotional manipulation disguised as concern. The dean placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder, perhaps sensing that the young man was approaching his emotional limit. But Ethan took a deep breath and continued. Writing this essay was the hardest thing I've ever done, because it meant acknowledging that someone I loved, someone who I knew loved me in her own way, was also someone I needed to protect myself from. It meant recognizing patterns that extended back through my father's childhood, and probably beyond that. It meant accepting that breaking these patterns would cause pain and conflict, but that the alternative, continuing the cycle, would cause even more damage to future generations. He held up his scholarship certificate, and I could see tears glistening in his eyes even from where I sat. This scholarship represents more than financial support for my education. It represents validation that my experience was real, that the emotional work I've done to understand and overcome toxic family dynamics matters, that choosing healing over pretending everything is fine is the right path. So thank you to the Harrison Foundation, and thank you to everyone who believed my story deserved to be heard. The applause that followed was deafening, but I barely heard it over the roaring in my ears. People around us were standing, giving Ethan an ovation, moved by his story of overcoming adversity. They didn't understand. They didn't know the full context. They didn't realize that everything I had done was motivated by love, and a desperate desire to see my family succeed in a world that showed no mercy to those who weren't prepared. I turned to Claire, searching her face for some sign that she understood, that she would defend me against these accusations. But Claire was crying, and when she finally met my eyes, what I saw there wasn't support or understanding. It was relief. Relief that someone had finally said out loud what she had apparently been thinking for years. "Did you know about this?" I demanded, keeping my voice low despite the rage and humiliation burning through me. "Did you know he was going to publicly humiliate me like this?" "I knew about the essay," Claire said quietly, wiping at her tears. "I helped him edit it. And Mom, it's not about humiliating you. It's about Ethan's truth." "His truth?" I hissed. "His truth is built on lies and exaggerations. I have done nothing but love and support this family, and this is how I'm repaid? With public embarrassment and accusations of being toxic." Marcus leaned forward, his expression harder than I had ever seen it. "Eleanor, maybe you should listen to what Ethan is saying. Really listen." "I don't need parenting advice from you," I snapped. "I raised 3 successful children. I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" Claire asked, and there was something new in her voice. Something like strength, like a door finally being opened after years of being locked. "Do you really think we turned out well because of your methods, or in spite of them?" Before I could respond, the ceremony concluded and people began standing, gathering their belongings, moving toward the reception area where refreshments were being served. Families clustered around their scholarship recipients, offering congratulations and taking photographs. I sat frozen in my seat, watching as Ethan descended from the stage and was immediately engulfed by well-wishers. I wanted to go to him, to pull him aside and explain why he was wrong, why his perspective was skewed, why he didn't understand all the sacrifices I had made. But my legs wouldn't move. Some part of me, some small voice I had spent decades suppressing, whispered that standing up right now would only make things worse, that Ethan had been prepared for this moment while I had been blindsided. "I'm going to go congratulate my son," Claire said, standing up. "You can join us or not. That's your choice." She walked away with Marcus and the twins, leaving me alone in the rapidly emptying auditorium. I watched through blurring vision as my daughter wrapped her arms around Ethan, watched as Marcus clapped him on the back with obvious pride, watched as my younger grandchildren bounced with excitement around their older brother. They looked happy. They looked like a family celebrating a wonderful achievement. And I was sitting alone in the third row, the grandmother who had been publicly identified as the villain in my grandson's inspiring story of personal growth and resilience. The auditorium continued to empty. Ushers began collecting programs and straightening chairs. A few people glanced my way with expressions that ranged from pity to poorly disguised satisfaction. I recognized some of them as other Northwestern parents I had met at previous school functions, people I had offered advice to about their children's futures, people who had smiled politely while probably thinking the same things Ethan had just said out loud. Finally, when the auditorium was nearly empty, I stood on shaking legs and made my way toward the exit. The reception area was crowded with happy families, but I could see my family. Clustered in a corner, Ethan still holding his certificate, still surrounded by people congratulating him. I took a step in their direction then stopped. What would I say? How could I walk up to my grandson and tell him I was proud of him when his achievement was built on the foundation of calling me toxic? How could I smile and pretend everything was fine when he had just shared our family's private struggles with hundreds of strangers? I turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward the parking lot, my heels clicking against the polished floor with sharp, accusing sounds. The October evening had grown colder, and I pulled my coat tighter as I searched for my car. My hand shook as I tried to fit the key into the ignition, tried and failed twice before succeeding. The drive back to Madison passed in a blur of confusion and mounting anger. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had convinced myself that Ethan had been manipulated, probably by Claire, who had never appreciated the sacrifices I had made for her. The essay was clearly an exaggeration, a strategic play designed to win sympathy and scholarship money by portraying himself as a victim. Colleges loved that narrative, didn't they? The student who overcame adversity to achieve greatness. I let myself into my empty house, the silence echoing in a way it hadn't before Robert died 3 years ago. When he was alive, the house had been quieter than I liked, but at least there had been another presence, another person to validate my perspective on family matters. Now I was alone with my thoughts, and those thoughts were becoming increasingly difficult to control. My phone buzzed with incoming text messages. I ignored it for several minutes, puttering around the kitchen making tea I didn't want, straightening furniture that didn't need straightening. Finally, I couldn't resist anymore. I picked up the phone and saw 17 text messages, most from family members I hadn't seen at the ceremony. My son David, Claire's younger brother, had written, "Mom, I just heard about Ethan's scholarship ceremony. We need to talk." My daughter Lisa, the youngest of my 3 children, had sent a longer message. "Claire told me what happened tonight. Mom, I know this must be incredibly painful for you, but maybe this is an opportunity for some real conversations about family patterns. I've been in therapy for years working through some of these same issues. I'd like to help you understand." Therapy. Of course Lisa was in therapy. She had always been the most sensitive of my children, the one who cried easily and took everything too personally. I had tried to toughen her up when she was young, tried to prepare her for a world that didn't care about feelings. Apparently, that had been another failure in parenting according to my ungrateful children. There were several messages from cousins and extended family members, most expressing shock and offering vague support that felt more like curiosity than genuine concern. But the message that made my chest tighten with something between hope and dread was from Ethan himself. "Grandma Eleanor, I know tonight was difficult for you. I didn't want to hurt you, but I needed to tell my truth. I hope someday we can talk about this honestly. I do love you, even though I can't be around you the way things have been. The scholarship committee has asked if I'd be willing to have my full essay published in their annual journal. I wanted you to know before it became public. Maybe reading the whole thing would help you understand." I read the message 3 times, each time feeling a different emotion. Hurt that he thought he needed to warn me about further public humiliation. anger that he was planning to extend this betrayal beyond one evening's ceremony. And underneath it all, something I didn't want to examine too closely, fear that reading his full essay might show me things about myself I had spent decades refusing to see. I set the phone down and looked around my immaculate living room. Everything was in its place, just as Robert and I had arranged it years ago. The furniture was expensive but not showy. The decorations tasteful but not ostentatious. It was the home of people who valued order and propriety, who understood that how you presented yourself mattered as much as who you were inside. But in that moment, the perfection of my surroundings felt less like achievement and more like armor. I had built this life, these standards, these expectations, to protect my family from the chaos and uncertainty that had marked my own childhood. My parents had been loving but disorganized, emotionally expressive but financially unstable. I had watched my father lose jobs because he was too friendly with everyone, too willing to bend rules, too focused on making people happy instead of making responsible decisions. I had watched my mother cry over unpaid bills and broken promises, her kind heart repeatedly taken advantage of by people who saw softness as weakness. I had vowed that my children would never experience that kind of instability. They would have structure, discipline, clear expectations. They would learn that love wasn't enough, that success required sacrifice and dedication, and the willingness to make hard choices. They would understand that the world demanded excellence, and I would prepare them to meet those demands. But somehow, despite all my efforts, despite all the time and energy and yes, money I had invested in their futures, my children had grown up to resent me. My grandson had won a $50,000 scholarship by writing about how damaged he had been by my influence. And I was sitting alone in my perfect house with no one to validate my version of events, no one to assure me that I had been right all along. The next morning, I woke early after a fitful night's sleep. My phone showed 6 missed calls from Claire and a voicemail I couldn't bring myself to listen to. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and did something I had told myself I wouldn't do. I searched for information about the Harrison Foundation Merit Award and its selection criteria. The foundation's website explained that the scholarship specifically sought students who had demonstrated exceptional emotional intelligence and personal growth in the face of difficult family circumstances. Past recipients' essays were featured prominently, stories of overcoming poverty, abuse, abandonment, and yes, toxic family relationships. Each essay was accompanied by a photograph of the scholarship recipient and a brief update on their progress through college. I read through several essays, my coffee growing cold beside me. One student wrote about escaping a father's physical abuse. Another described surviving a mother's addiction. A third detailed the experience of being disowned after coming out as gay. These were real traumas, real suffering. How could Ethan's experience possibly compare to these stories? But as I continued reading, I found essays that hit closer to home. A young woman who wrote about her mother's relentless criticism and impossible standards. A young man who described his father's use of shame as a motivational tool. A student who detailed the emotional exhaustion of never being good enough, never earning unconditional approval, never feeling safe to be themselves around the people who claim to love them most. These students didn't describe obvious abuse. They described something more insidious, more difficult to name. They described being slowly worn down by constant criticism, by conditional love, by the burden of other people's expectations. And when they described the behavior of their toxic family members, I heard echoes of my own voice in my head, my own words that I had always believed were helpful. You could have done better if you tried harder. I'm only telling you this because I love you and want you to succeed. You're being too sensitive. I'm just being honest. You'll thank me someday when you understand I was right. I closed the laptop abruptly, my hands shaking. This wasn't right. They were misunderstanding. Context mattered. Intent mattered. I had never hit my children, never denied them food or shelter, never abandoned them when they needed me. I had been present at every school function, every sports event, every milestone. I had provided financial support even when it strained my own budget. I had given them everything they needed to succeed. Except apparently, I had failed to give them the one thing they wanted most: unconditional acceptance. The freedom to make their own choices without my judgment hanging over them like an axe waiting to fall. The space to fail without it becoming evidence of their inadequacy or my disappointment. My phone rang again. This time it was David, my middle child. the son who had moved to Seattle after college and visited only twice a year. We had always had a cordial but distant relationship, largely because I had never quite forgiven him for choosing a career in environmental science over the business degree I had encouraged him to pursue. I answered on the fourth ring. "Mom," David said, and his voice was gentle in a way that immediately put me on edge. "Claire told me what happened at Ethan's ceremony. I wanted to check in on you." "I'm fine," I said automatically, "though I'm sure you're all having a good laugh at my expense." "Nobody's laughing, Mom. This isn't about making fun of you. It's about finally having honest conversations about family dynamics that have needed addressing for a long time." "Honest conversations," I repeated bitterly. "Is that what we're calling public humiliation now?" David was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was firm. "Mom, I'm going to say something I should have said years ago. Ethan's essay didn't surprise me at all, because I could have written something very similar about my own experience growing up." The words hit me like cold water. "What are you talking about? I gave you every opportunity, every advantage." "You gave us a lot of things," David agreed. "But you also gave us constant criticism, impossible standards, and the message that we were never quite good enough as we were. Do you remember when I told you I wanted to major in environmental science?" "Of course I remember. You were throwing away your potential on a field with limited career prospects." "I was following my passion," David corrected. "I was choosing a field I cared deeply about, a field where I could make a real difference. And instead of supporting that choice, you spent my entire senior year of high school telling me I was making a mistake, that I was being impractical, that I should think about the family's reputation and choose something more prestigious. I was trying to help you avoid future regrets," I protested. "No, Mom. You were trying to control my choices so they aligned with your vision of success. And when I went ahead with environmental science anyway, you made sure I knew I had disappointed you. Every phone call, every visit home, you found ways to mention how my cousins were doing in their more lucrative careers, how I could have been earning so much more if I'd listened to you." I felt tears prickling at my eyes. "I just wanted you to have financial security. I wanted you to be respected." "I am respected," David said quietly. "I'm respected by my colleagues, by the organizations I work with, by the communities I help. I'm happy with my life, Mom. I'm proud of the work I do. But I spent years in therapy learning how to silence your voice in my head, the voice that told me I wasn't successful enough, wasn't prestigious enough, wasn't enough, period." "Therapy," I said, the word tasting bitter. "You and Lisa both. I suppose I'm the villain in your therapist's office too." "You're not a villain, Mom. You're a complex person who loves us but doesn't always know how to show it in healthy ways. That's what Ethan was trying to say in his essay, that you're not malicious, but that your behavior still causes harm. That loving someone doesn't automatically mean your actions are loving." I sat down heavily on my kitchen chair. The phone pressed against my ear. "I don't understand. I did everything I thought a good mother should do. I provided structure, discipline, guidance. I pushed you all to be your best selves. But whose definition of best were we trying to meet?" David asked. "Yours or ours? And what message does it send when love feels conditional? When approval has to be earned through achievement? When simply being your authentic self is never quite good enough?" I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up with emotions I didn't have names for, feelings I had spent my entire adult life trying to avoid. "Mom, I know this is hard to hear," David continued. "But Ethan writing that essay, Claire supporting him, Lisa and I being honest with you now, this is all happening because we love you and we want a real relationship with you. Not a performance where we pretend everything is fine. A real relationship where we can be honest about how your behavior affects us and work together to do better." "You want me to change," I said, hearing the bitterness in my own voice. "After 68 years of living a certain way, you want me to suddenly become a different person. I want you to be willing to examine your patterns and consider that maybe, just maybe, the way you've approached family relationships hasn't been as helpful as you believe," David said. "That's all we're asking. Not perfection. Not instant transformation. Just willingness to listen and try." After I hung up with David, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, watching sunlight move across the floor as morning turned to afternoon. My tea grew cold, my stomach rumbled with hunger I didn't feel. I thought about calling Lisa, demanding that she explain her years of therapy, her accusations of family patterns that needed breaking. I thought about calling Claire, asking her how she could betray me by helping Ethan write an essay that painted me as toxic. I thought about driving back to Evanston and confronting Ethan directly, making him understand that he had gotten everything wrong. But instead, I did something I had never done before. I opened my laptop and Googled, "Am I a toxic grandmother?" The search results were overwhelming. Articles, forums, quizzes, personal stories. I clicked on one titled 10 Signs You Might Be a Toxic Grandparent, and started reading, my heart sinking with each item on the list. Do you criticize your adult children's parenting decisions in front of their kids? Yes, I had done that. Multiple times. I had told Claire she was too lenient with the twins. I had corrected Ethan's table manners in front of his friends. I had questioned Marcus's discipline strategies in front of the entire family. Do you use guilt to manipulate family members into spending time with you? I thought about the times I had told Claire that I might not have many years left, that she should prioritize visiting me over other activities. I thought about the comments I had made about how lonely I was since Robert died, how my children never seemed to have time for me. Do you give unsolicited advice and then become upset when it's not followed? Every single family gathering, every phone call, every visit. I had opinions about everything from career choices to parenting strategies to home decoration, and I made sure everyone knew when they didn't follow my guidance. Do you compare your grandchildren to each other or to other children? Ethan had mentioned this specifically in his speech. I had always thought I was motivating them to try harder, to achieve more. But maybe, and this thought made my chest ache, maybe I was just making them feel like they were never good enough as they were. I closed the laptop again, unable to read anymore. The afternoon sun had shifted, and my kitchen was growing dim. I should get up and turn on lights, should make myself some dinner, should do something productive instead of sitting here wallowing in self-pity. But I couldn't seem to move. My entire identity was built around being the strong matriarch who held the family together, who made the hard decisions, who wasn't afraid to tell uncomfortable truths. If I was actually the toxic grandmother who had damaged her own family in the name of helping them, then who was I? The doorbell rang, startling me out of my spiral of thoughts. I considered not answering, pretending I wasn't home. But I could see a familiar car in my driveway through the window. Lisa had driven up from Chicago. I opened the door to find my youngest daughter standing on my porch, holding a bakery box. She looked tired, her curly hair pulled back in a messy bun, her face free of makeup. In her mid-30s, Lisa had never been concerned with the same standards of presentation that I valued. She wore comfortable clothes and sensible shoes and didn't apologize for either. "Hi, Mom," she said quietly. "I brought cannoli from that Italian place you like. Can I come in?" I stepped aside to let Lisa in, and she walked straight to my kitchen as if she had never left home. She had always been comfortable here in a way that made me simultaneously proud and irritated. Proud because she felt at home in the house I had created. Irritated because she never seemed to appreciate the effort that went into maintaining such a space. Lisa opened the bakery box and arranged the cannoli on one of my good china plates without asking. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot I had made hours ago and forgotten about, microwaving them both before sitting down at the kitchen table across from where I had been sitting all day. "You drove 3 hours to bring me pastries?" I asked, hearing the defensive edge in my voice. "I drove 3 hours because you're my mother and I love you, and I knew you were probably sitting here alone convinced that your entire family hates you," Lisa said simply. She pushed one of the coffee cups toward me. "Which isn't true, by the way. But I understand why you might feel that way." I stared at the cannoli, those perfect tubes of crispy pastry filled with sweet ricotta cream, dusted with powdered sugar. They had been Robert's favorite. Lisa knew that. She was offering me comfort in the form of remembered sweetness, and part of me wanted to reject it just to prove I didn't need comforting. "David called you," I said. It wasn't a question. David called me. Claire called me. Even Marcus called me. Which, if you knew Marcus, you'd understand is significant because he avoids family drama like it's contagious. Lisa took a bite of her cannoli, getting powdered sugar on her nose in a way that made her look 12 years old again. "We're all worried about you, Mom. This was never about humiliating you or ganging up on you. It was about Ethan finally telling his truth, and all of us supporting him in that." His truth? I repeated, the phrase feeling foreign in my mouth. Everyone keeps saying that. As if there's some objective reality where I'm the villain and he's the innocent victim. What about my truth? What about the context of why I parented the way I did? Lisa set down her half-eaten cannoli and leaned forward, her brown eyes serious. Okay, tell me your truth. I'm listening. The invitation caught me off guard. I had expected arguments, justifications, more accusations. I hadn't expected an actual invitation to explain myself. And now that I had the opportunity, I found myself struggling to put into words the complicated mixture of fear and love that had motivated every decision I had made as a mother and grandmother. I grew up poor, I finally said, the words coming slowly at first, then faster as decades of unspoken history began spilling out. Not poverty line poor, but the kind of poor where you're always one unexpected expense away from disaster. My father was a good man, Lisa. Kind, funny, loved by everyone in our neighborhood. But he couldn't hold down a job to save his life because he was more concerned with being liked than being reliable. He'd take long lunch breaks to help a coworker with a problem. He'd call in sick to attend a friend's daughter's wedding. He'd lend money we didn't have to people who never paid it back. Lisa nodded, encouraging me to continue. My mother cried herself to sleep more nights than I could count, worried about bills, about the mortgage, about how she was going to feed 3 kids when Dad had been laid off again because he couldn't understand that being a good person wasn't the same as being a good employee. The memories were bitter in my mouth, sharp with resentment I had thought I'd buried. I watched them struggle. I watched my mother's hair turn gray before she was 40 from the stress. I watched my father's confusion when people took advantage of his kindness, when being friendly and accommodating didn't translate into job security or financial stability. That must have been really hard, Lisa said softly. It was terrifying, I corrected. I promised myself that my children would never experience that kind of instability. They would understand that the world doesn't care if you're nice. Cares if you're competent, reliable, successful. I wanted to prepare you for reality, not send you out into the world expecting everyone to be as forgiving as my father's friends pretended to be. So you decided to be hard on us instead, Lisa said, not accusingly, just stating a fact. You thought that if you criticized us enough, pushed us enough, held us to impossible standards enough, we'd be tough enough to survive whatever the world threw at us. Yes, I said, feeling a wave of relief that she understood. Exactly that. Lisa was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in slow circles on the table. Mom, can I tell you about something that happened when I was 14? I tensed, preparing myself for another accusation. Another example of how I had failed as a parent. All right. I was in a school play. Just a small production of our town, nothing fancy. I had worked so hard to memorize my lines, had stayed after school for weeks of rehearsals. I was playing Emily, the lead role, and I was so nervous and so excited. Lisa's voice had taken on a distant quality, as if she were watching the memory play out in front of her. You and Dad came to the performance. You sat in the 3rd row, just like you did last night at Ethan's ceremony. And I was so aware of you watching me, so desperate to make you proud. I remembered that play. I remembered Lisa in her period costume, her hair pinned up in an old-fashioned style. I remembered thinking she was rushing some of her lines, not projecting her voice enough. After the play, all the other parents were giving their kids flowers and hugs and telling them how wonderful they'd been, Lisa continued. My friends' parents were taking photos, making a big fuss, celebrating. You know what you said to me? I didn't remember my exact words, but I could guess the gist of them. I had been trying to help her improve, to identify areas where she could do better next time. You said, "That was nice, sweetheart, but you need to work on your projection." I could barely hear you from the 3rd row. And you were rushing in the scene with George. Take your time with the emotional moments. They're what the audience came to see. Lisa's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Dad tried to soften it by saying I'd done a great job. But you cut him off and said it wouldn't help me to pretend I'd been perfect when there were clear areas for improvement. I was trying to help you develop a growth mindset, I said. But the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. I didn't want you to become complacent. I was 14 years old, Mom. I had just performed in front of 300 people. I was shaking with nerves and adrenaline and hope, All I wanted was for my mother to tell me she was proud of me, that I'd done well, that the hours of work had been worth it. A single tear rolled down Lisa's cheek. Instead, I learned that no matter what I did, it would never be quite good enough for you. There would always be notes, always areas for improvement, always ways I had fallen short of your expectations. The memory clicked into place from my perspective, and with it came a sickening realization. I had been sitting in that auditorium thinking about all the drama coach's techniques Lisa hadn't employed, about how her performance compared to professional standards. I had been so focused on making sure she understood there was room for growth that I had completely missed the opportunity to simply celebrate her achievement. "I'm sorry," I said, the apology surprising us both. "I didn't realize that's how it made you feel." "That's the thing, Mom. You never asked how it made me feel. You just assumed that your way of showing love was the only way, the right way, the helpful way." Lisa wiped at her eyes. "After that play, I stopped trying to make you proud. I still worked hard in school, still did my best, but I stopped hoping that someday I'd do something that would make you look at me and just say, 'I'm proud of you,' without any qualifications or suggestions for improvement. I thought about all the times I had watched my children and grandchildren perform, compete, present their work. How many moments of pure joy had I stolen by treating every accomplishment as a stepping stone to the next level of achievement, rather than something worth celebrating in its own right. The therapy I've been in," Lisa continued, "has helped me understand that you were doing the best you could with the tools you had, that your childhood with financially unstable parents made you terrified of raising children who weren't prepared for a harsh world. But Mom, there's a difference between preparing someone for challenges and making them feel like they're never enough as they are." "I always thought I was being realistic," I said quietly. "The world is competitive. It doesn't hand out participation trophies. I wanted you to be ready for that. But you weren't just preparing us for a competitive world. You were creating a home environment where we were competing for your approval, where love felt conditional on achievement, where we learned to hide our vulnerabilities because showing weakness or making mistakes would trigger your disappointment." Lisa reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. "Mom, I still flinch when my boss calls me into her office, even when I know I haven't done anything wrong. I still have panic attacks before performance reviews. I still hear your voice in my head pointing out everything I could have done better every time I accomplish something I'm proud of. That's the legacy of growing up with constant criticism disguised as help." I wanted to pull my hand away, to defend myself, to explain that she was being too sensitive, that she was misinterpreting tough love as harm. But I couldn't seem to form the words. Instead, I sat there feeling something crack open inside me, some carefully constructed wall beginning to crumble. "David told me he's been in therapy too," I said. "Apparently, I'm the primary topic of conversation." "You're not the only topic," Lisa said with a slight smile. "We all have our own stuff to work through. But yes, understanding how our childhood shaped our adult patterns has been an important part of the process for both of us. And for Claire too, though she's less open about it." "Claire's in therapy?" I felt blindsided. My eldest daughter, the one I had always thought was the most well-adjusted, the most successful at managing family and career. "Why didn't she tell me?" "Because you've made it very clear over the years that you don't think therapy is necessary, that it's just an excuse for people to wallow in victimhood, instead of taking responsibility for their own happiness." Lisa said it matter-of-factly, without accusation. "You've told me at least a dozen times that my generation is too fragile, too focused on feelings, not tough enough to handle normal family dynamics." Had I said that? Yes, I realized with growing discomfort. I had said exactly that, multiple times, usually after Lisa or one of my other children mentioned therapy or mental health or the importance of processing emotions. "I thought I was encouraging resilience," I said weakly. "You were encouraging suppression," Lisa corrected gently. "There's a difference between resilience, which is the ability to experience difficult emotions and recover from them, and suppression, which is pretending those emotions don't exist and judging people who acknowledge them as weak." We sat in silence for a few moments, the cannoli forgotten on the plate between us. Outside, I could hear children playing in a neighbor's yard, their laughter carrying through the October afternoon. Normal sounds of normal life, while inside my kitchen, My entire understanding of myself as a mother and grandmother was being systematically dismantled. I need to tell you about something else, Lisa said, and the shift in her tone made me look up sharply. Something I've never told you because I knew how you'd react. All right, I said, bracing myself. When I was 24, I was engaged. His name was Michael and I loved him completely. He was funny, kind, creative. He was a musician, played guitar in a folk band. We were planning to get married that summer, had already started looking at venues. Lisa's voice trembled slightly. And then I brought him home to meet you and Dad. I did remember this vaguely. A young man with longish hair and an earring, playing guitar in my living room while Lisa watched him with adoring eyes. I had thought at the time that he seemed directionless, more interested in pursuing artistic dreams than building a stable career. You pulled me aside after that first dinner, Lisa continued. And you told me that Michael seemed nice but that I should think carefully about what kind of life I'd have with a musician. You said I'd seen firsthand with your own parents what happened when someone prioritized passion over practicality. You said I was smart enough and accomplished enough to attract someone with better prospects, someone who could provide the kind of security I deserved. I opened my mouth to defend this advice. It had been sound, hadn't it? Musicians rarely made stable incomes. I had been trying to protect Lisa from the kind of financial struggles my parents had endured. Over the next few months, every time I mentioned Michael, you found ways to express your concerns. Always subtle, always framed as loving worry. You'd ask about his income, his career plans, his ability to support a family. You'd mention friends of friends whose daughters had married doctors or lawyers or businessmen. You never outright said, "Don't marry him." But the message was clear. What happened? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. I broke up with him, Lisa said, and her voice broke on the words. I convinced myself that you were right, that love wasn't enough, that I needed to be practical. Michael was devastated. He didn't understand why I was ending things when everything had seemed so perfect between us. I couldn't explain that my mother's disapproval had poisoned everything, that I couldn't imagine building a life with someone my family didn't respect. Did you ever regret it? The question escaped before I could stop it. Every single day for the past 12 years, Lisa said, wiping at her eyes. Michael was the love of my life, Mom. He was kind and supportive and believed in my dreams even when they changed. He's married now, has 2 kids, still plays music on the weekends while working as a music teacher during the week. He found a way to balance passion and stability, exactly like I knew he would. But I let your fear convince me to walk away from the best relationship I've ever had. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Lisa, I was just trying to protect you from making the same mistakes my parents made. I didn't want you to struggle financially, to have your dreams limited by a partner's lack of ambition. But Michael wasn't lacking ambition. He just defined success differently than you did. And more importantly, it wasn't your decision to make. Lisa's voice was firm now, angry in a way I'd rarely heard from her. You didn't get to decide what kind of life I should have, what kind of partner I should choose, what trade-offs I was willing to make. That should have been my choice based on my values and my vision for my future. Not yours. I'm your mother, I protested. I'm supposed to guide you, to help you avoid mistakes. Guide, yes. Control, no. Lisa stood up abruptly, pacing to my kitchen window and staring out at the backyard where she and her siblings had played as children. Do you know what the worst part is? I'm 37 years old. And I'm still single because every relationship I've had since Michael has been measured against your standards instead of my own happiness. Every man I date, I find myself asking, would Mom approve of his career? Would she think he's ambitious enough, successful enough, appropriate enough? And then I resent both him and myself for caring what you think. The pain in her voice was unbearable. I wanted to comfort her, to take back the advice I'd given 12 years ago, to tell her to go find Michael and explain everything and beg for another chance. But I couldn't undo the past any more than I could undo all the other moments when my fear and my need for control had damaged the people I loved most. I didn't know, I said, the words inadequate. You never told me you were that serious about him. Because you didn't want to know. Lisa turned to face me. You didn't ask about my feelings for him, about what made him special, about what our relationship was like when we were alone together. You only asked about his career prospects and his financial situation. You reduced a complex human being whom I loved to a set of statistics that didn't meet your standards. She was right. I had done exactly that. Not just with Michael, but with Marcus when Claire had brought him home. With David's college girlfriend who had seemed too clingy and dependent. I had evaluated my children's romantic partners like they were job applicants, checking boxes on a list of qualifications rather than trying to understand what made these relationships meaningful to my children. I'm sorry, I said again, and this time the words came out as barely a whisper. Lisa, I'm so sorry. I didn't understand what I was doing. I thought I was helping. I know you did, Lisa said, returning to the table but not sitting down. That's what makes it so complicated. You weren't trying to hurt us. You genuinely believed that your way of loving us was the right way, the only responsible way. But Mom, impact matters more than intent. The fact that you meant well doesn't erase the harm you caused. Before I could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Claire's name, and I almost didn't answer. But Lisa gestured for me to take it, sitting back down across from me with an expression that suggested she wasn't leaving anytime soon. Hello, I said, my voice hoarse from crying. Mom. Claire's voice was tight, controlled. Ethan wants to talk to you. He's here with me now, and he has something he'd like to say. Are you willing to listen? I looked at Lisa, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, I'm willing to listen. There was a rustling sound as the phone changed hands. Then Ethan's voice, the same voice that had spoken so eloquently about overcoming toxicity just last night, came through with a tremor of nervousness. Hi, Grandma Eleanor. Hello, Ethan. I didn't know what else to say. How did you greet the grandson who had just won $50,000 by writing about how damaged he'd been by your influence? I know last night was really hard for you, Ethan began. I know you probably feel betrayed and hurt and angry. I need you to understand that I didn't write that essay to hurt you. I wrote it because I needed to process my own experience, and the scholarship committee asked me to share it publicly, because they thought it might help other students who are dealing with similar family dynamics. You called me toxic in front of hundreds of people, I said, not quite able to keep the bitterness out of my voice. You used my full name. You share private family moments with strangers. I know, Ethan said quietly, and I agonized over whether to use your real name or a pseudonym. In the end, I chose to use it because part of breaking cycles of family dysfunction is being honest about where those patterns come from. Not to shame you, but to acknowledge reality. And what reality is that? I demanded. That I'm a terrible grandmother who ruined your childhood? No, Ethan said firmly. The reality is that you're a grandmother who loves me, but who also uses criticism and control as expressions of that love, and that those expressions have caused real harm. Both things are true at the same time. You love me and your behavior has been damaging. Those facts don't cancel each other out. I closed my eyes, pressing my free hand against my forehead where a headache was beginning to throb. I don't know how to be different than I am. I'm 68 years old. My entire understanding of how to be a good parent, a good grandmother, is built on principles I learned from my own upbringing. Learning from my parents' mistakes, preparing children for a difficult world, maintaining high standards. I'm not asking you to change overnight, Ethan said. I'm asking you to be willing to examine your behavior and its impact. To maybe, possibly, consider that there might be other ways to show love that don't involve constant criticism and control. To listen when we tell you that something you've said or done has hurt us, instead of dismissing our feelings as oversensitivity. Mom, Claire's voice came back on the line. Ethan showed me the full essay before he submitted it. With your permission, he'd like to send it to you. Not to cause more pain, but because he thinks reading his complete thoughts, including the parts about how he understands why you are the way you are, might help you understand what we've all been trying to say. Every instinct I had screamed to refuse. Reading that essay would mean confronting every criticism, every judgment, every moment of my behavior that had been harmful even when I'd meant well. It would mean seeing myself through my grandson's eyes and accepting that the person I believed myself to be, the devoted grandmother, the family pillar, the voice of wisdom and experience, wasn't how my family actually experienced me. But Lisa was watching me with an expression of cautious hope. And somewhere in my chest, beneath all the defensiveness and hurt pride and fear, was a small voice asking whether I wanted to be right or whether I wanted to have real relationships with my children and grandchildren. All right, I heard myself say. Send me the essay. After I hung up, Lisa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That was really brave, Mom. I don't feel brave, I admitted. I feel terrified. That's kind of the same thing, Lisa said with a small smile. Bravery isn't not being scared. It's being scared and doing the thing anyway. She stayed with me for another hour and we talked about smaller things. Her work at the nonprofit organization where she was a program director, the garden she was planning for next spring, a book she thought I might enjoy. Normal conversation that felt strange and precious after the intensity of everything we'd discussed. When she finally left, hugging me tightly at the door and promising to call tomorrow, I felt simultaneously exhausted and oddly lighter, as if I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't known was there. I made myself some soup for dinner, forcing down food I didn't taste. Then I opened my laptop and found the email from Ethan waiting in my inbox. The subject line read simply my essay. I stared at it for 10 minutes before finally clicking it open. The essay was 12 pages long, single-spaced, and it began with a scene I remembered vividly from a different perspective than the one Ethan described. When I was 7 years old, I entered my first science fair. I had worked for weeks on a project about plant growth, carefully documenting how different amounts of water affected bean seedlings. I was so proud of my display board with its neat graphs and colorful photos. I was certain I would win first place. Instead, I won second place, and my grandmother's response shattered what should have been a moment of childhood pride. I remembered that science fair. I remembered thinking that Ethan's project had been good but not exceptional, that he hadn't gone deep enough into the scientific method, that his presentation could have been more polished. I had pointed these things out to help him do better next time, to teach him that participation wasn't the same as excellence. But as I read Ethan's account of that day, how he had stood in front of his project, his second-place ribbon clutched in his small hand, waiting for praise that never came, hearing instead a detailed critique of his shortcomings, I saw the moment through his eyes for the first time. A 7-year-old boy whose joy in his achievement was poisoned by his grandmother's inability to simply celebrate with him. The essay continued through years of similar moments. Birthday parties where I had commented on the cake being too sweet, or the decorations being too juvenile for Ethan's age. School concerts where I had noted the mistakes in his performance rather than the courage it took to perform. Family dinners where I had corrected his grammar, his posture, his choice of topics for conversation. Each incident was described not with anger but with a kind of anthropological observation, as if Ethan were studying a specimen of toxic family behavior and trying to understand its origins and effects. My grandmother genuinely believes she is helping, Ethan wrote in the middle of the essay. She has told me many times about her own parents, about her father's inability to hold a job, about her mother's financial anxieties. She watched her parents struggle and she vowed that her children would be different, tougher, more prepared, more successful. In her mind, every criticism is an investment in my future. Every impossibly high standard is training for a world that shows no mercy to the unprepared. She loves me. I have never doubted that. But her love is wrapped in so many conditions, so many expectations, so many judgments, that I've spent my entire life trying to earn her approval while knowing that I never quite will. I had to stop reading, pressing my hand against my mouth to stifle a sob. He understood. Despite everything, despite the harm I had caused, Ethan understood that I had been trying to help. But understanding my motivations didn't change the impact of my behavior. It didn't undo the damage. I forced myself to keep reading. Ethan described the vacation cancellation incident in painful detail, not just what had happened, but how it had affected his perception of his mother, his grandmother, and family relationships in general. He wrote about learning to hide his accomplishments from me to avoid the inevitable critique. He wrote about the anxiety he felt before every family gathering, preparing himself for comments about his appearance, his grades, his choices. He wrote about watching me do the same thing to his mother, to his Uncle David, to his Aunt Lisa, and realizing that this pattern extended back generations. The moment I truly understood I needed to break free from this pattern, Ethan wrote near the end of the essay, came during my junior year of high school. I had been accepted into a competitive summer program for aspiring writers at the University of Iowa. I was thrilled. Writing is my passion, and this program would help me develop my skills while connecting with other young writers. When I told my grandmother, her response was immediate and devastating. Writing is a nice hobby, but you can't make a career out of it. You should focus on more practical skills for college applications. Have you considered business camps or engineering programs? She wasn't trying to crush my dreams. She was trying to redirect me toward what she perceived as a more secure future. But the message I received was that my passion didn't matter, that practical considerations should always override personal fulfillment, that who I wanted to be wasn't as important as who she thought I should be. I remembered that conversation. I had been trying to be realistic, trying to help Ethan understand that following your passion was a luxury not everyone could afford. But I hadn't asked him why writing mattered to him. I hadn't explored what the program would teach him, or how it might contribute to his growth. I had simply dismissed his excitement and redirected him toward fields I deemed more valuable. The essay concluded with Ethan's reflection on what he had learned through therapy, and his own research into family systems and generational trauma. Breaking free from toxic family patterns doesn't mean cutting off everyone who has ever hurt you. It means establishing boundaries, developing self-awareness, and refusing to perpetuate harmful behaviors. It means acknowledging that you can love someone and still recognize that their behavior is damaging. My grandmother did the best she could with the tools she had, shaped by her own traumatic childhood experiences. Understanding that context helps me have compassion for her. But compassion doesn't require me to subject myself to ongoing harm, or to pretend that her behavior hasn't affected me. I am writing this essay as both an acknowledgement of what I've experienced, and a commitment to break these patterns in my own future relationships. I will not pass this legacy of conditional love and constant criticism onto my own children someday. The cycle ends with me. I closed the laptop, tears streaming down my face. Ethan's essay wasn't just an indictment of my behavior. It was a carefully researched, thoughtfully articulated analysis of intergenerational trauma and the courage required to break destructive patterns. He had done the work I had never done, examining where his family's dysfunction came from, understanding how it had shaped him, and making a conscious choice to create something different for the future. And he had won $50,000 for that essay. Not because he was playing victim, but because his story of self-awareness and intentional growth was genuinely inspiring. The scholarship committee had recognized something I had failed to see, that acknowledging harm and choosing to do better is an act of tremendous courage and character. I sat in my dark kitchen for a long time, Ethan's words echoing in my mind. The cycle ends with me. He was breaking a pattern that I had inherited from my parents and passed on to my children without ever questioning whether it was healthy or helpful. He was choosing consciousness over conditioning, intentional relationship building over automatic pattern repetition. And I had two choices. I could continue insisting that I had been right all along, that my methods were justified by my good intentions, that my family was being oversensitive and ungrateful. Or I could follow Ethan's example and do the hard work of examining my own behavior, acknowledging the harm I had caused, and choosing to do better going forward. The first choice was easier. It allowed me to maintain my self-image as the misunderstood matriarch who had sacrificed everything for her ungrateful family. But it would also mean losing the real relationships I claimed to value. Watching my children and grandchildren slowly drift away until my visits became obligatory rather than desired. Until family gatherings were performances rather than genuine connections. The second choice was terrifying. It meant admitting I had been wrong about fundamental aspects of how to love and support the people closest to me. It meant apologizing not just with words but with changed behavior. It meant learning new patterns at an age when most people's personalities were set in stone. It meant being vulnerable enough to ask for help, to admit I didn't have all the answers, to accept that my way of doing things hadn't been the only right way. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. Mom, I know you're probably processing a lot right now. Just want you to know that we're here when you're ready to talk. No judgment, no demands. Just love and hope for something better. No judgment. Felt like an impossible promise. How could there not be judgment after everything that had been said, everything I had done? But maybe that was the point. Maybe David was offering something I had never learned how to give. Unconditional acceptance, space for imperfection, relationship that wasn't dependent on meeting impossible standards. I picked up my phone and typed a response, deleting and retyping several times before finally settling on something simple. Thank you. I read Ethan's essay. I'm starting to understand. This is hard, but I want to try. The response came back almost immediately, as if David had been waiting by his phone. That's all we can ask for. Love you, Mom. I stared at those 3 words. Love you, Mom. When was the last time I had told my children I loved them without qualifying it with concerns about their choices or suggestions for improvement? When was the last time I had expressed love as pure acceptance rather than anxious guidance? I couldn't remember. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. It was Sunday, and I had always insisted that my children bring their families to my house for Sunday dinner when they were in town. It was a tradition I had maintained religiously, a weekly gathering where I could oversee my family, ensure they were all doing well, keep tabs on the grandchildren's development. But this Sunday I didn't want them to come to me. I wanted to go to them. I called Claire first, catching her as she was making breakfast for the family. Mom. She sounded surprised to hear from me so early. Is everything okay? I'd like to come over today if that's all right with you, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. I was used to summoning my children to my territory, not asking permission to enter theirs. I know it's short notice, but I'd like to talk to Ethan. And to you and Marcus. About everything. There was a pause, and I could hear muffled conversation in the background as Claire conferred with someone, probably Marcus. Of course you can come over, Claire finally said. We're not doing anything special today. Just a normal Sunday. Is noon okay? Noon is perfect. Thank you, Claire. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I barely tasted, trying to organize my thoughts. What did I want to say to them? I'm sorry felt inadequate, but it was also essential. I need to do better. But how did you promise to change behaviors that had been reinforced over 7 decades? I love you, but they already knew that, didn't they? The problem had never been a lack of love. The problem was how I expressed that love. I arrived at Claire's house at exactly noon, punctual as always. Their home was a modest 2-story colonial in a family-friendly neighborhood, with toys scattered across the front lawn and a basketball hoop in the driveway. I had always thought the house was too small for a family of 5, that they should have saved more aggressively for something larger, more impressive. But as I walked up the front path, I noticed things I had overlooked before. The flower garden Claire had planted along the walkway, bursting with late-season blooms. The welcome mat that read, "All are welcome here," in cheerful letters. The children's artwork displayed prominently in the front windows. This wasn't just a house. It was a home, filled with the kind of warmth and casual comfort I had always dismissed as disorder. Claire opened the door before I could knock, as if she had been watching for my arrival. She looked different today, more relaxed in jeans and an old college sweatshirt, her hair in a messy ponytail. On any other Sunday, I would have commented on her appearance, suggested she dress more appropriately even for a casual family day. Today I bit back the criticism and simply smiled. Hi, Mom. Come in. The living room was chaotic in the way that homes with young children always are. The twins were sprawled on the floor building an elaborate Lego city, arguing good-naturedly about architecture. Marcus was in the kitchen, and I could smell something delicious cooking: chicken, garlic, herbs. Ethan was sitting on the couch with a book, but he set it aside when he saw me. Hi, Grandma Eleanor, he said, his voice cautious but not unkind. Hello, Ethan. I sat down in the armchair across from him, perched on the edge as if I might need to flee at any moment. Thank you for sending me your essay. I read the whole thing last night. And Ethan's expression was guarded, braced for criticism or dismissal. And you're an exceptional writer, I said, watching his eyebrows rise in surprise. Your ability to analyze complex family dynamics with both emotional honesty and intellectual rigor is impressive. The scholarship committee was right to recognize your work. It wasn't what Ethan had expected me to say. I could see him processing my words, searching for the but that usually followed my compliments, the qualification that would transform praise into criticism. Thank you, he said carefully. I also need to apologize to you, I continued, forcing myself to maintain eye contact even though every instinct told me to look away. Everything you wrote in that essay was true. I have been critical and controlling. I have used shame and impossible standards to try to motivate you and your mother and your uncle and aunt. I have made you feel like you're never quite good enough as you are. And I'm deeply, profoundly sorry for the harm I've caused. The silence that followed was broken by one of the twins dropping a Lego piece with a loud clatter. Claire appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, Marcus right behind her. They had clearly been listening. "Mom," Claire said softly, and I could hear the emotion in her voice. "Do you mean that?" "I mean it," I said, and felt tears gathering in my eyes. "I've spent the past 24 hours thinking about my life, about the patterns I inherited from my parents and passed on to you, about all the ways I thought I was helping when I was actually hurting. I don't know how to be different yet. I don't know if I can unlearn 68 years of behavior. But I want to try." Ethan leaned forward, his young face serious and open. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you remember the vacation Mom planned to Florida? The one you told her to cancel?" The memory made me wince. "Yes, I remember." "Do you remember why you told her to cancel it?" I thought back to that day, to my panic when Claire had mentioned the cost of the vacation rental, the flights, the activities they had planned. I was worried about the expense. I thought the money would be better spent on your college fund, on securing your future. "But did you ask Mom what the vacation meant to her?" Ethan pressed gently. "Did you ask why she had been saving for it, what she hoped we'd experience as a family?" I shook my head slowly. "No. I saw the dollar amount and immediately decided it was irresponsible. I didn't ask for context. We had just gone through a really hard year," Claire said, sitting down on the arm of the couch next to Ethan. "Marcus had lost his job, and we'd been stressed and fighting more than usual. The kids had picked up on the tension. I had been planning that vacation as a way to reconnect as a family, to give the kids some happy memories that weren't overshadowed by financial anxiety. Yes, it was expensive. Yes, the money could have gone into savings. But sometimes what a family needs isn't more money in the bank. Sometimes they need experiences that remind them why they're a family in the first place." "I didn't know," I said, the excuse sounding hollow even as I spoke it. "You didn't tell me about Marcus losing his job." "Because I knew how you'd react," Claire said, not unkindly. "I knew you'd tell me we should have saved more in our emergency fund, that Marcus should have been networking better, that we should have seen it coming and prepared. I didn't tell you because I couldn't handle your criticism on top of everything else we were dealing with." The realization hit me like a blow. My children had learned to hide their struggles from me, not because they didn't trust me, but because they couldn't afford my response to their difficulties. I had created a family dynamic where problems were kept secret, because honesty invited judgment. "When you told me to cancel the vacation," Claire continued, her voice thick with emotion, "I was already feeling like a failure as a mother, as a wife, as a provider. And your criticism confirmed every terrible thing I'd been thinking about myself. So I canceled it. I cried myself to sleep that night because I had been so excited to give my kids this experience, and instead I was disappointing them again." And Ethan was old enough to understand exactly why the vacation had been canceled, old enough to hear your words to me and internalize the message that his mother's choices were wrong, that his family's needs didn't matter as much as abstract future planning. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, the words feeling inadequate. "Claire, I'm so sorry." Marcus spoke up from where he stood in the kitchen doorway. "Eleanor, can I say something?" I nodded, bracing myself. "I've been part of this family for 18 years now," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "And in all that time I don't think I've ever heard you ask any of us about our happiness. You ask about our jobs, our finances, our children's grades. You offer advice about career moves and parenting strategies and time management. But you never ask the most basic question. Are you happy? Are you fulfilled? Are you living a life that feels meaningful to you?" His observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. I realized that I had measured my family's success by external metrics, income, achievement, social standing, without ever considering whether they were actually satisfied with their lives. "You're right," I admitted. "I've been so focused on practical concerns that I've ignored the emotional and psychological needs of the people I love most." "It's not too late to change that," Marcus said. "But it requires real change, not just acknowledgement. It requires you to do the uncomfortable work of examining why you parent and grandparent the way you do, and choosing different responses even when every instinct tells you to revert to old patterns." The twins had abandoned their Legos and were watching our conversation with wide eyes. I realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in our family. Honest conversation about difficult topics, vulnerability instead of defensiveness, accountability instead of excuses. I'd like to ask all of you something, I said, looking around at Claire, Marcus, Ethan, and even the curious twins. What would you need from me to rebuild trust? What would healthy relationship look like? Claire and Marcus exchanged glances, communicating in the silent shorthand of long-married couples. Ethan shifted in his seat, considering his response carefully. I need you to respect my boundaries, Ethan finally said. When I tell you that something you've said or done has hurt me, I need you to listen and apologize without getting defensive or explaining why you were right to do it. I need to feel like my feelings matter, even when they're inconvenient for you. I need you to stop offering unsolicited advice about how I raise my children, Claire added. If I ask for your input, I want your wisdom. But if I don't ask, I need you to trust that Marcus and I are capable of making our own parenting decisions. And I need you to respect our choices even when they're different from what you would choose, Marcus said. We're not going to live our lives according to your blueprint, Eleanor. We're going to make our own decisions, our own mistakes, our own successes. We need you to be a supportive presence in that, not a critical judge. Each request felt like a small death of my role as I had understood it. I was supposed to be the wise elder, the voice of experience, the person who guided younger generations away from mistakes. But what they were asking was for me to step back, to trust them, to accept that my way wasn't the only right way. I can try to do those things, I said slowly. But I need you to be patient with me. I'll make mistakes. I'll probably slip back into old patterns sometimes. I'll need you to call me out when I do, and give me chances to do better. We can do that, Claire said, and I heard hope in her voice. As long as you're genuinely trying, we can meet you halfway. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, and it was different from any family gathering we'd ever had. We ate the lunch Marcus had prepared, a delicious chicken dish with roasted vegetables, and I caught myself starting to comment on the salt levels, then stopped. It was perfectly seasoned, and even if it hadn't been, it wasn't my kitchen, wasn't my meal, wasn't my place to critique. After lunch, the twins showed me their Lego city, and I listened as they explained the intricate logic behind their design. I wanted to suggest structural improvements, more realistic proportions, better organizational principles. Instead, I asked questions. What made you decide to put the fire station next to the school? How did you choose the colors for the houses? They beamed at my attention, at being heard rather than corrected. Ethan talked to me about his plans for college, his excitement about the writing program he'd been accepted into. I felt the familiar urge to steer him toward more practical majors, to express concern about career prospects for writers, to offer statistics about average incomes in creative fields. But I remembered his essay, his description of the Iowa writing program incident, and I swallowed all of that. Tell me what you love about writing, I said instead. What draws you to it? Ethan's face lit up in a way I'd rarely seen. He talked about the power of stories to create empathy, about his fascination with character development, about the craft of language and the challenge of finding exactly the right words. He talked for 20 minutes, his passion evident in every word, and I listened without interrupting, without redirecting, without judging. That sounds wonderful, I said when he finished. I'm excited to see where this passion takes you. The shock on his face told me how rare such uncomplicated support had been. Really? You're okay with me majoring in creative writing? It's not about me being okay with it, I said carefully. It's your life, your education, your future. What I think should be much less important than what you want. But yes, if you're asking, I think pursuing something you're passionate about is a valid and worthwhile choice. After I left that afternoon, driving back to Madison through the Sunday evening traffic, I felt exhausted but also strangely hopeful. The conversation had been difficult, the apologies had felt inadequate, and I knew this was just the beginning of a long process of rebuilding relationships I had damaged over decades. But at least I was starting. At least I was trying. When I got home, there was an email waiting from Lisa with a subject line that read, "Something that might help." She had sent me links to several books about family systems, generational trauma, and healthy relationships. She'd also included information about a therapist who specialized in working with older adults on family dynamics and behavior change. "Mom," she wrote in the email, "I know this is overwhelming. I know it's scary to realize that patterns you've relied on for your entire adult life, might not be serving you or the people you love. But I also know you're brave enough to do this work. You raised 3 kids mostly on your own while Dad worked long hours. You supported us financially even when it was a stretch. You've always been strong. Now it's time to be strong in a different way. Strong enough to be vulnerable, strong enough to change, strong enough to admit you don't have all the answers. I believe you can do this. And I'm here to support you however I can. Love, Lisa. I sat at my computer reading and rereading her words. Lisa believed I could change. My children were willing to give me a chance to do better. Ethan had won a scholarship by writing about overcoming my influence, but he'd also said he loved me, that he understood I'd been doing my best with the tools I had. Maybe that's all anyone could ask for. To do your best with what you know. And to be willing to learn better when you realize your best wasn't good enough. I clicked on the therapist's website and read about her approach to family systems work. She specialized in helping people understand and interrupt patterns of intergenerational dysfunction. Her philosophy emphasized that change was possible at any age, that awareness was the first step, and that healing relationships required courage and commitment from everyone involved. I picked up the phone and dialed before I could talk myself out of it. The answering service took my information and promised someone would call back within 24 hours to schedule an initial consultation. As I set the phone down, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I looked older than I felt, my face lined with worry and years of holding myself rigid against a world I'd always perceived as threatening. But there was something different in my expression now. Maybe it was the beginning of self-awareness. Maybe it was the first stirrings of real change. I thought about Ethan's essay about his phrase, "The cycle ends with me." He had been talking about refusing to pass on toxic patterns to future generations. But maybe the cycle could also end with me in a different way. Maybe I could be the one to break the pattern I'd inherited from my own parents, the pattern of fear-based parenting, of conditional love, of impossible standards. Maybe it wasn't too late for me to learn a different way. That night, I took out a notebook and began writing. Not an essay like Ethan's, not anything I planned to share. Just an honest accounting of the moments I could remember where I had prioritized control over connection, criticism over encouragement, my own anxiety over my family's actual needs. The list grew longer than I wanted to admit: birthday parties, school performances, graduation celebrations, holiday dinners, ordinary Tuesday afternoons when a casual comment from me had deflated someone's joy or confidence. But I also wrote about the moments I was proud of. Times when I had shown up for my children even when it was inconvenient. Times when I had sacrificed to give them opportunities I'd never had. Times when I had tried, however imperfectly, to protect them from the financial instability that had marked my own childhood. My intentions had been good. That much was true. But intentions didn't erase impact. And my impact on the people I loved most had been far more harmful than I'd ever wanted to acknowledge. The work ahead would be long and difficult. There would be setbacks, moments when I'd slip back into old patterns, times when I'd want to give up and insist that everyone else was wrong and I was right. But I owed it to my family and to myself to try. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.